They say love can conquer anything, even death itself. But what happens when a creature has lived so long in darkness that he's forgotten what it means to feel? Tonight, we discover whether a frozen heart can truly be thawed, or if some souls are lost forever. King Adrian's world had become a wasteland of silence, not the peaceful kind, the suffocating kind. The kind that pressed against your ears until you wanted to scream just to shatter it. But he never screamed. He never even breathed. For 1,000 years, he'd sat on a throne carved from a mountain's heart, ruling a kingdom of ghosts while his own existence stretched out before him like an endless gray corridor with no doors, no windows, no escape. He was the most powerful creature in the realm, feared by mortals and immortals alike. And he was completely, utterly hollow. His throne was cold against his equally cold form. He did not breathe. His heart did not beat. These were facts as immutable as the stone beneath him and the curse flowing through his veins instead of blood. He existed in sensory purgatory. The world reached him as mere data, empty of meaning. He could hear the clock, but it was meaningless rhythm. He could see warmth as infrared signatures, not comfort. Food was ash, wine was dust, and the memory of sunlight was white-hot agony he'd trained himself to forget. He was a king of shadows and silence, his power absolute, his loneliness infinite. The great doors groaned open, a vulgar disruption in his sanctuary of perfect, lifeless order. He didn't turn his head. His gaze remained fixed on the tall, arched window framing star-dusted sky. The stars were cold, distant points in black nothing. Then came the cascade of unwelcome sensations. The rhythmic thud of a living heart, wool against stone, the scent of rain-damp earth and crushed herbs. And beneath it all, the most disturbing sensation: heat. A small, mobile sun had entered his frozen world. He finally allowed his gaze to drift. She stood inside the doorway, flanked by 2 guards whose dead flesh seemed to shrink from her vitality. She wasn't remarkable by fleeting mortal beauty standards: dark, unruly hair, an earnest rather than symmetrical face. But she was a bonfire in his monochrome existence. Heat rolled from her skin, a physical force against his cold form. He could see it. A faint, shimmering aura making dust motes dance. And he could hear it, the frantic drumbeat of her pulse in the delicate throat vein, a trapped bird in a porcelain cage. The thirst, that cold wind perpetually howling in his chest's hollow space, stirred with interest. "Leave us," Adrian commanded. His voice was low resonance without breath's warmth. Sound scraped from dust and time. The guards bowed stiffly and retreated into shadows. The doors boomed shut. The woman didn't flinch. She simply watched, eyes wide and intelligent. "King Adrian," she said. Her voice was an anchor pulling the present into sharp focus, clear, steady, laced with warmth that seemed to travel through frigid air and touch his skin like physical caress. "You are the witch," he stated, not a question. His sources were impeccable. Lyra, a practitioner of ancient, deeply sentimental magic. She claimed to mend things meant to remain broken. "I am," she confirmed, stepping forward. Her boot on marble was an offense. "I've come to offer you a bargain." A dry rasp of amusement escaped his throat. "Bargains imply I have something to gain. I possess everything I desire." "You possess a throne," she corrected, gently but firmly. "You rule a kingdom of ghosts. But you don't possess the memory of sunlight. You don't know the taste of bread or the feeling of sleep. You have nothing, my lord. You are an echo in an empty hall." His stillness became absolute. Her words weren't insults, they were observations, delivered with calm certainty more unsettling than any challenge. She saw the truth of his existence, the terrible exchange he'd made. He'd bartered his humanity for eternal gray twilight. For a moment, the thirst sharpened not with hunger, but strange ancient anger. He could cross the room in less than a heartbeat, feel her fragile neck bones snap between his fingers, silence the infuriating, hypnotic heartbeat forever. But he didn't move. He was, if nothing else, disciplined. "And what do you offer, little witch?" he asked, tone dropping into silken danger. "A cure for a condition I've mastered for 1,000 years?" "Not a cure," she said, gaze unwavering. "A restoration. I can give you back what you've lost, your humanity, the ability to feel, to taste, to live." He almost laughed. An impossibility. When you became vampire, your soul wasn't destroyed or traded to demons, it was frozen, locked away to protect you from the agony of what you'd become. That's the fundamental law of our existence. "My magic doesn't retrieve what's lost," Lyra countered. "It thaws what's dormant. But ice won't melt without heat. That heat is love." He inclined his head slowly, carrying centuries of ennui. "Continue." "The ritual has 30 stages, 30 days. Each day I must plant a seed of memory, sensation, or emotion, rebuilding your soul piece by piece. The final night requires a blood offering, the key to unlock what we've built. But there's one critical component." She paused. "You must fall in love. With me." The silence was so complete her heartbeat seemed to fill the entire cavernous space. Then Adrian laughed, a real sound, dry and brittle, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. Pure intellectual derision. "Love," he repeated, the word tasting like foreign ash. "You speak of chemical reaction, fleeting hormonal surge designed to propagate a fragile species. I am beyond such biology." "Love is the anchor of the soul, Adrian," she said, using his name with familiarity that should have been fatal. "It's the one force strong enough to call it home. I can perform the ritual, weave the spells, but the final lock can only be turned by genuine emotional connection. The love must be mutual and present, not grief for the dead, but active choice between two living souls. That's what calls the soul forward." She stepped closer, and he caught himself tracking the movement with predatory focus. "But I must warn you, if you reach the 30th day having feigned love, the ritual will still attempt to complete. With no genuine feeling to anchor it, your soul will be ripped apart. You'll go mad. It's happened before, so don't play games unless you're willing to risk complete annihilation." He rose from his throne, fluid, silent, predator uncoiling. He flowed across marble, distance collapsing in seconds. He stopped mere inches from her, close enough to feel heat radiating like a furnace, to see minute pupil dilation as his proximity registered as primal threat. Her scent, rain, herbs, and sweet metallic tang of blood singing beneath skin, was suffocating perfume. He tilted his head, studying the pulse fluttering at her throat base, frantic, mesmerizing rhythm. The thirst clawed inside him, scraping at Control's walls. "An interesting gambit," he whispered, voice cold draft against her cheek. "You believe you can ignite fire in a mountain of ice, make a statue feel." "I do," she said. To his astonishment, her voice held no fear tremor, only conviction. He considered her proposition. The sheer arrogance was almost refreshing. In his long, unchanging existence, novelty was the rarest commodity. This mortal spark attempting to breach his apathy's fortress was a game he found himself willing to play. But her warning echoed. This wasn't just calculated risk, it was genuine danger. If he played at love without feeling it, he'd face something worse than his current existence. Madness. Obliteration. Still, the alternative intrigued him more. For 30 days, he would be the perfect subject. He would observe, study, perhaps even participate. And if, impossibly, something genuine stirred, well, that would be the most fascinating outcome of all. "Very well, witch," he said, pulling back. "A wager. For 30 days, I am yours to restore. If, at the end, I have fallen in love with you, my humanity returns. In exchange for this miracle, I grant your sanctuary for wayward magical creatures my permanent, inexhaustible patronage. You'll never want for gold or protection again." He saw relief flicker in her eyes, quickly masked. She had a cause. Her sanctuary was failing. 3 months ago, a vampire lord in the east had begun hunting her refugees for sport. She needed protection only the most powerful could provide. But she'd refused to bargain with another monster. So she'd gambled everything on impossible hope. That she could turn a monster into a protector. It made her predictable. It made her vulnerable. "And if you fail," he continued, voice dropping again, silken threat returning. "If on the 30th day I remain as I am, cold, empty, utterly unmoved by your charms, what then?" Lyra lifted her chin. The column of her neck was long and pale in gloom, vein a delicate blue line. "If I fail, I'll publicly declare my magic a fraud and its principles worthless. And I'll serve you, in whatever capacity you see fit, for 1 year. His lips curved into a semblance of a smile, cold, sharp. A year. A year to have this warmth, this life, this defiant pulse at his beck and call. "An acceptable risk," he murmured. "But understand this, the ritual binds us both to truth. On the 30th night, when you ask if I love you, my heart will answer, not my words. If there is love, my blood will call to yours. If there is none, the magic will know. Neither of us can lie." Her eyes widened slightly. She hadn't mentioned that component. He'd just raised the stakes for both of them. "The wager is set," he said. "The ritual begins tomorrow at dusk. Do not be late." He turned, dismissing her, flowing back to his throne and settling into its cold embrace. The echo of her heartbeat already faded as she was escorted out. Silence returned, deeper now, more profound. It was no longer a state of being. It was an absence, the absence of her. He pushed the thought aside. An anomaly, a flicker in the gray. For 30 days he would play his part. He was King Adrian, master of his domain, master of himself. He was utterly incapable of feeling. He was certain he would win. The first day began in the profound stillness of his private chambers. The sun, the great eraser, had been vanquished, and the long night stretched before him. Lyra was brought to the grand library, a room housing 1,000 years of collected knowledge, every volume bound in leather and smelling of dust and decay. She, by contrast, smelled of baked bread and cinnamon. The scent was violent intrusion, a memory so deeply buried he couldn't immediately place it. From the before, from the time of warmth and breath. He watched from towering bookshelf shadows as she entered, eyes sweeping endless rows of spines. She carried a small covered basket. "Good evening, my lord," she said, voice echoing slightly in the vast, silent space. She wasn't intimidated by the room's scale, or by him. She placed her basket on a large mahogany table, wood so dark it was almost black. "The ritual begins?" he asked, stepping from shadows. His movement was utterly silent, yet she didn't startle. She simply turned to face him, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "The ritual is always beginning," she replied, removing the cloth from her basket. Bread and cinnamon scent intensified, a warm, sweet cloud in cold, dry air. She'd brought food. For herself, of course. He hadn't eaten in 900 years. As she worked, he noticed faint shimmer around her fingers, barely visible runes traced in the air as she arranged the bread, the steam, the simple act of preparation. She was already weaving the first thread of magic, planting the first seed. "The first step is for you to observe," she said, "to remember." She sat at the table and broke off a piece of dark, crusty bread. Steam rose, a ghost of heat made visible in the chill. He remained standing, obsidian statue of stillness, and watched her. He watched her fingers, deft and sure, tear the piece away. He watched her lift it to her lips, the way her eyes closed for a fraction of a second in simple animal pleasure as she took a bite. He heard the faint sound of her chewing, soft, rhythmic, living noise. It was grotesque. It was mesmerizing. He felt phantom sensation on his own tongue, the memory of texture, of crust giving way to soft warmth, taste of grain and salt and yeast. The memory was pale, faded watercolor. The reality of his own mouth was dry, dusty void. He could put bread in his mouth. It would turn to flavorless grit, like chewing sand. "You find this fascinating?" he asked, voice carefully neutral, playing his part. The curious, detached subject. Lyra swallowed, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "I find it human. Nourishment isn't just about fuel. It's about community, about pleasure, about the simple act of being alive and needing the earth to sustain you. This is something you've forgotten." "I haven't forgotten," he corrected, tone sharp with unexpected irritation. "I've transcended the need for it. It's a weakness, a chain binding you to soil." "Is it?" she asked, taking another bite. She looked directly at him as she chewed, gaze open and challenging. "Or is it a connection? Tell me what you remember of your last meal as a man." The question ambushed him. He hadn't thought of it in centuries. The memory, when it came, wasn't watercolor, but sudden, sharp glass shard in his mind. A rough wooden table, flickering tallow candlelight, stew thick with root vegetables and tough meat. A woman's hand, his wife's, reaching across to touch his. The warmth of her skin. The taste of salt, not just from food, but from tears on her face. She'd been afraid for him. He was riding out to a battle he wouldn't survive. The memory was so vivid, so complete, that for a horrifying instant he could feel the phantom heat of her hand on his own, could taste the salt. The thirst inside him coiled, a cold serpent, not hunger for blood, but a different ache, a hollow longing for something he'd willingly, stupidly thrown away. He forced the memory down, crushing it back into the dark vault where it belonged. "I remember nothing of consequence," he lied, voice a flat, cold plane of sound. "It was sustenance, nothing more." Lyra said nothing. She simply continued eating her bread, her silence more potent accusation than any words. He was the king, the predator, the immortal power in this room. And yet he felt exposed. A ghost watching a feast. A creature of absolute lack, observing a creature of simple, profound abundance. He'd intended to observe her with detached scientific curiosity. Instead, he found himself cataloging every detail with painful, desperate intensity. The way a crumb clung to her lower lip, the soft sound of her breath, the steady, infuriating beat of her heart. Constant reminder of everything he was not. The first day was not yet over, and his perfect, unassailable control was already fraying at the edges. He was supposed to be acting, performing the part of a man intrigued, but the terrible truth, a truth he'd never admit, was that no acting was required. He was utterly, unwillingly captivated. The days that followed settled into strange, unnerving rhythm. Lyra would arrive at dusk, a small sun of warmth and life pushing back ancient chill. She didn't perform grand rituals or chant in forgotten tongues. Her magic was quieter, more insidious. Each night, he noticed, she'd trace those faint runes while working, on the bread she baked, in the air while telling stories, woven into the music she played. She was literally rebuilding his soul piece by piece, each day planting another seed of memory, sensation, emotion. She spoke of the world outside his walls, a world that continued to turn, to change, to live. She described autumn forest colors, sea scent after storms, cool mud between toes. Not as lecturer, but as painter, using words to splash vibrant, impossible color across his perception's gray canvas. He would listen, face a mask of detached indifference, while inside a storm of forgotten sensations raged. He remembered salt spray sting on his face, damp smell of decaying leaves. These weren't his memories anymore. They were artifacts from another man's life, a man he'd murdered 1,000 years ago to become this. On the 7th night, she brought a record player, clunky modern contraption of wood and brass. He regarded it with disdain. What is this vulgar machine? It's music, she said, hands gentle as she placed black vinyl disc upon the turntable. Not the precise courtly compositions your ghostly musicians play. Something with a pulse. She lowered the needle. After static crackle, sound filled the library. A woman's voice, raw and soulful, accompanied by melancholy cry of a stringed instrument he didn't recognize. The music wasn't structured like formal pieces he knew. It was chaotic, emotional, full of sorrow and strange, defiant joy. It spoke of heartbreak and resilience, of love that was wound and salvation all at once. He stood by the cold, empty fireplace, listening. The singer's voice swelled, a wave of pure, powerful feeling washing over him. He felt answering vibration deep within his chest, in the place where his silent heart lay dormant. It was an ache, a painful resonance, as if unused string on ancient instrument had been plucked. He found himself thinking of his wife's face, of her tears at that last meal. He remembered how she'd sung to their child, a simple, sweet lullaby. This music was nothing like that, and yet it evoked the same profound, unbearable sense of loss. "What is this feeling?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. A crack in the facade, moment of genuine, unplanned curiosity. Lyra looked at him, expression soft in dim light. "It's called the blues. It's the beauty in sadness. It's a way of turning pain into something you can share. It's another part of being human." He hated it, hated how it made the hollow space inside him feel heavier, denser, hated the vulnerability it exposed. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to command her to stop it. He listened until the last note faded, leaving silence no longer empty, but pregnant with the ghost of that raw human sound. He was supposed to be in control, dispassionate observer of her foolish experiment, but she was the one conducting him, playing on the dormant strings of his long-dead humanity, and he was beginning to fear the song she was creating. The second week was marked by their first accidental touch. They were in the observatory, a circular room at the top of the highest tower, its domed ceiling enchanted to show perfect, cloudless view of the night sky. He hadn't been there in centuries. The stars, to him, were cold, unchanging data points. To her, they were a source of wonder. She was pointing out a constellation, arm extended toward the star-dusted dome, voice full of almost childlike enthusiasm. He moved to stand beside her, intending to offer some dry academic correction about the star's spectral class. His hand brushed against hers. The contact was a cataclysm, a supernova of sensation in his dead universe. Her skin wasn't just warm, it was searing. A jolt of pure biological heat, almost painful. It was soft, alive, the texture of a living thing. The shock was so profound it bypassed conscious thought. A short, sharp sound, something like a gasp, was torn from his throat. A sound made without breath, purely psychic reaction. He recoiled as if burned, pulling his hand back and cradling it against his chest. His gray vision flickered. For a split second, he saw a burst of impossible color, a flare of gold and crimson behind his eyes. The thermal contrast was absolute. His flesh was marble, hers was fire. In that single fleeting moment of contact, he'd felt the chasm between their existences more keenly than ever before. He was the cold of the grave, and she was the heat of the sun. He stared at his hand, at the place where she'd touched him. He could still feel the phantom imprint of her warmth, a tingling echo sinking deep into his very being. He felt sudden violent flare of the thirst, but it was different this time. It wasn't cold, calculating desire for sustenance. It was hot, desperate hunger to feel that searing warmth again, to press his cold lips to her skin and drink not just her life, but her life force, her vitality, her fire. A desire to consume her, to make her part of his own frozen existence, to steal the heat she so effortlessly possessed. The thought was monstrous, predatory. It terrified him with its intensity. "My apologies," Lyra said, voice soft, pulling him back from the precipice. She was watching him, expression unreadable. Did she know? Could she sense the monster that had just stirred within him? "The fault was mine," he managed to say, his own voice sounding strained, unfamiliar. He forced his hand to unclench. He was losing control. This game was becoming dangerous. The carefully constructed walls of his apathy, built over a millennium of disciplined solitude, were beginning to show cracks. And through those cracks, something terrible and beautiful was beginning to shine through. He looked from his hand to her face, at the genuine concern in her eyes. She wasn't afraid of him. She should have been. Everyone should have been. Her lack of fear was perhaps the most disarming weapon she possessed. He'd built an empire on fear, and she was dismantling it with a touch, a song, a simple, unafraid gaze. The wager had seemed a simple intellectual exercise, a way to pass a few decades. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't wagered a year of a witch's service. He'd wagered himself. The 15th night brought a storm. It was violent, elemental, a tantrum of nature that rattled ancient castle stones. Wind howled through crenellations like mournful beast, and rain lashed against tall Gothic windows. Lyra arrived soaked, her cloak dripping onto marble floors, hair plastered to her skin. She was laughing, face flushed with exhilaration of her battle against the elements. The sight of her, so vibrant and alive in the face of the storm's fury, was strange and compelling portrait. She looked like a force of nature herself. They sat in the library, only light coming from a candelabra she'd insisted on lighting. Small dancing flames threw flickering shadows against towering shelves and cast warm golden glow on her face. The storm outside was constant percussive roar, a world away from the intimate circle of light they inhabited. For the first time, his castle didn't feel like a tomb. It felt cozy, a shelter. The word was foreign, unwelcome. "You're not disturbed by the storm?" he asked, voice low murmur beneath thunder's growl. He stood by the window, watching lightning fork across black sky. It was a display of raw power he could appreciate on intellectual level, but it evoked no feeling in him. "Disturbed? I love it," she replied, voice full of genuine warmth. She had a cup of something steaming in her hands, and chamomile honey scent filled the air. "It's a reminder that the world is wild, that we aren't in control of everything. It's humbling." He turned from the window to look at her. Control is not a thing to be surrendered, it's a thing to be seized. It's the only thing that separates order from chaos, survival from extinction. "You have perfect control, Adrian," she said softly, eyes meeting his over the rim of her cup. "You have a fortress of order and survival. Are you happy?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it disarmed him completely. Happy. The word was meaningless. It was a concept for creatures who experienced a spectrum of emotion. He experienced only two states: the dull, constant ache of the thirst and the gray stillness of its absence. He didn't answer. He couldn't. The lie he'd prepared, a cool, dismissive remark about the irrelevance of mortal feelings, wouldn't form on his lips. A particularly violent crack of thunder shook the castle. The candles on the table flickered wildly. One went out. In the ensuing darkness, a new sound reached him, sharp and clear beneath the storm's fury. A gasp, and then a small, choked sob. His senses, honed by 1,000 years of predatory stillness, focused entirely on her. He saw a slight tremor in her hands, the way she'd curled in on herself just for a moment. He was across the room in an instant, movement a silent blur of shadow. He stopped before her chair, looming over her. The scent of her fear was a spike in the air, sharp and intoxicating. But it was mixed with something else. Salt. The smell of her tears. "The lightning," she whispered, not looking at him. Her voice was small, fragile. "I've never liked it." He saw it then. The vibrant, fearless woman who'd faced down an ancient vampire king was afraid of a storm. It was a crack in her own facade, a glimpse of vulnerability that mirrored his own, albeit in different form. He'd expected her to be a pillar of unwavering strength, a magical force to be contended with. But in this moment, she was just a woman, frightened of the dark and the noise. A strange, unfamiliar impulse moved through him. Not pity, not contempt. Protective. A fierce, primal urge to stand between her and the raging storm, to shield her from the thing that frightened her. It was the same instinct that had flared when he'd first touched her, the desire to possess and shield. But this time it was untainted by the predatory edge of the thirst. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, movement slow, deliberate, giving her time to pull away. He took the cup from her trembling hands and set it on the table. Then his cold fingers brushed against her cheek, a shocking point of contact. Her skin was wet with tears. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. Her eyes were wide, luminous in candlelight, shimmering with unshed tears. He saw his own reflection in them, a dark, still figure, the monster. But she wasn't looking at him with fear, not anymore. She was looking at him with raw, open trust that was a physical blow. "It is only light and sound," he said, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "It cannot harm you in here. I will not allow it." The words were spoken before he'd consciously formed them. A promise. A vow. He, who hadn't made a promise to another living soul in a millennium, had just offered her his protection. From a storm. The absurdity of it wasn't lost on him, but the sincerity of the sentiment was undeniable. He held her gaze for a long moment, thunder rolling outside, candles flickering between them. The air was thick with unspoken things, with charged energy of two solitudes colliding. He could feel the frantic beat of her heart through the palm of his hand, a wild, beautiful rhythm that seemed to be calling to the silent dead thing in his own chest. He didn't know what was happening to him. He only knew that the gray stillness of his existence was being shattered, and in its place something terrifying and vivid was beginning to grow. He'd thought this was a game he was playing. He now understood it was a spell she was weaving, and he was hopelessly, utterly caught in its threads. The 20th day marked a shift. It was subtle, a change in the very atmosphere of the castle. The stillness he'd cultivated for centuries no longer felt like peace. It felt like a void. Her nightly presence was no longer intrusion but expectation, a focal point around which his endless sleepless nights now revolved. He found himself anticipating the sound of the great doors opening, the scent of life she brought, the splash of color she represented in his monochrome world. He began to remember things. Not just great traumatic memories of his turning or his last human meal, but smaller, more intimate details from his mortal life. The specific shade of blue of his wife's eyes, the weight of his infant son sleeping on his chest, the taste of fresh water from a mountain spring. These memories came unbidden, triggered by a word from Lyra, a scent, a gesture. They were agonizingly sweet, shards of a life he'd discarded, and they left him with hollow ache that the thirst couldn't touch. One evening she found him in the armory, a vast hall filled with silent, gleaming instruments of death from a dozen different eras. He was standing before a suit of polished steel plate, his own armor from his human life. He ran a cold finger over intricate engraving on the breastplate, a snarling wolf, the sigil of his family. "This was yours," Lyra stated, voice soft behind him. She didn't ask. She knew. "It belonged to a man I once knew," he replied, voice distant. "A foolish, passionate man who believed in honor and glory. He died on a field in the mud, clutching a sword and a fistful of broken promises." "He didn't die," she said, stepping to his side. The warmth of her was familiar presence now, a small sun in the cold metallic room. "He changed. He survived. He did what he had to do." He turned his head to look at her, gaze sharp. "You seek to romanticize it. There was no nobility in it. It was a desperate, cowardly bargain made in the dark. I traded the warmth of my wife's bed and the sound of my son's laughter for this." He gestured around the cold, silent hall, at the endless night visible through the arrow-slit window. An eternity of this. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her, perhaps the most honest thing he'd said in 500 years. The admission left him feeling raw, exposed, as if he'd peeled back his own ribs to show her the empty cavity where his heart should be. Lyra didn't offer platitudes or false comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on the cold steel of the breastplate next to his. Her fingers were inches from his own. He could feel the heat of her, a living presence against the dead metal. "That man is still in there, Adrian," she whispered. "I can feel him. He's not gone. He's just sleeping." He wanted to believe her. Gods, he wanted to. For the first time in centuries, the prospect of his own immortality felt not like a triumph, but like a prison sentence of unbearable length. He'd thought his inability to feel was a strength, a shield that made him invincible. He now saw it for what it was, a cage. He was a spectator to life, a ghost haunting the halls of his own existence, and she was offering him a key that required him to do the one thing he was certain he could not. He looked at her hand, so close to his, at the life pulsing just beneath her skin. The thirst was a low hum, a constant companion, but it was overshadowed now by a different, more profound hunger. A hunger for connection. A hunger to feel the warmth of her hand not as a predator, but as a man. The final week was an exercise in exquisite torment. The proximity between them was constant, tangible. The air crackled when she entered a room. Every conversation was laden with subtext, every shared silence a universe of unspoken feelings. He'd abandoned the pretense of acting. His fascination with her was no longer performance. It was the central truth of his existence. He found himself studying the way light caught in her hair, the way she smiled when she spoke of her sanctuary, the small frown of concentration appearing between her brows when she was reading. These were the details of life, the tiny, insignificant moments that made up mortal existence, and he was memorizing them as if preparing for an examination he knew he was destined to fail. On the 29th night, the eve of the final day, she didn't come to the library or observatory. His guards informed him she was in the castle kitchens, a place he hadn't set foot in since the last of his human servants had died centuries ago. He found her there, in a cavernous room of cold stone hearths and dusty iron pots. She'd managed to build a fire in one of the massive fireplaces, and the room was filled with shocking, unfamiliar warmth. She was kneading dough on a large wooden table, sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a dusting of flour on her cheek. The domesticity of the scene was so alien, so profoundly out of place in his dead castle, that he could only stand in the doorway and watch. The scent of yeast and warmth and wood smoke wrapped around him, a potent cocktail of forgotten sensations. It smelled of home. It smelled of life. He watched her hands moving, those same faint runes traced in the dough as she worked, the final seeds being planted. The 29th layer of the spell. Tomorrow would be the 30th, the last. "The final part of the ritual," she said without looking up from her work, "requires a shared meal, an offering." "I cannot eat," he said, the words tasting like failure. "I know," she replied, hands moving with practiced rhythmic grace, pushing and folding the dough. "But you can share in the act. You can sit at the table. You can watch. You can remember what it was to be a man who could be nourished. The magic is in the intent, Adrian, the connection." He watched her for a long time, firelight dancing in her eyes, the simple, focused movements of her hands creating something that would sustain life. She was bringing life into the very heart of his death. He felt a wave of something so powerful, so overwhelming, that it almost brought him to his knees. It was a tidal wave of grief for the man he'd been, of awe for the woman she was, and a terrifying burgeoning tenderness that he had no name for. It was a fire in his chest, a warmth spreading through his frozen limbs, a feeling so immense it threatened to shatter his carefully maintained composure. He realized, with a sense of dawning horror and wonder, what was happening. She was winning. The witch was winning her impossible wager. He slowly walked to the table and sat in the chair opposite her. He didn't speak. He just watched her work, the fire crackling beside them, the scent of nascent life filling the air. He was a king in a kitchen, a creature of eternal night bathed in warm glow of mortal fire. And for the first time in 1,000 years, he didn't feel like a king at all. He felt like a man on the verge of either salvation or annihilation, and he was no longer certain he could tell the difference. The 30th night had arrived, the final night. The air in the throne room was thick with tension, almost a physical presence. Lyra stood before him, not as petitioner or subject, but as equal. She wore a simple white dress, stark contrast to the oppressive shadows of the hall. She held no magical totems, no ancient grimoires. There was only her, a vessel of quiet, determined power. He sat on his cold stone throne, the mask of the impassive king firmly in place. But beneath it, a silent, frantic war was being waged. His entire being, every fiber of his ancient, cursed existence, was screaming in protest against the coming change. The stillness was safe. The gray was known. To feel again was to invite pain, to remember loss, to become vulnerable. "The 30 days have passed," he said, voice low, controlled resonance betraying none of the chaos within him. "The wager is at its end. Perform your final ritual, witch. Prove your magic or concede your failure." "There is no spell left to cast, Adrian," she said, voice soft but clear in the echoing silence. "No incantation to speak. The magic was in the moments between us, the music, the storm, the bread. The 30 seeds have been planted. The final step is not a work of magic, but an act of faith, an offering." She took a step closer, and then another, until she stood directly before the dais. She met his gaze, and her eyes were full of terrifying, beautiful sincerity. "The wager was that you would fall in love with me. Did you?" The question hung in the air, a simple, impossible query. He could lie. He could summon the cold, calculating creature he'd been for a millennium and deny it all. He could dismiss her efforts as charming, but ultimately futile diversion. He would win the bet. He would have her in his service for a year, a prize, a pet, a source of warmth to observe from safe distance. He would remain in his cold, safe, gray prison forever. The words of denial formed in his mind, logical and precise. "I feel nothing. You have failed." But when he opened his lips to speak, the lie died on his tongue. He looked at her face, at the woman who'd brought color into his monochrome world, who'd shown him beauty in sadness, who'd braved his darkness with nothing but her own inner light. He remembered the shock of her touch, the scent of her hair, the sound of her laughter. He remembered the protective rage he'd felt, the agonizing sweetness of his rediscovered memories, the overwhelming tenderness that had bloomed in the wasteland of his soul. He could not lie to her. He would not. And the ritual's binding, it wouldn't let him lie anyway. His heart would answer. His blood would call to hers. The truth would be known. "Yes," he breathed, and the word was a surrender. It was a quiet admission that shattered his world. "Yes." A slow, radiant smile spread across Lyra's face. It was like watching the sun rise for the first time. "I know," she whispered, "but the magic required you to say it, to accept it." She reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew a tiny silver ritual knife. Its edge gleamed in dim light. Before he could react, she drew the blade swiftly across the palm of her own hand. A line of crimson welled up, shockingly bright against her pale skin. The scent of her blood hit him like a physical blow, sharp, sweet, overwhelmingly potent. The thirst, the ancient monster within, rose with a roar, a screaming, clawing hurricane of need threatening to consume his last vestiges of control. His fangs, dormant for years, descended with an audible click. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "This is the final offering," she said, voice steady despite the predator he'd become before her. She held her hand out to him. "Not as food for the monster, Adrian, but as a gift for the man. Blood is life. It's the seat of the soul. Accept this, not with the thirst, but with the love you feel. Let it be the anchor that pulls your humanity home." He stared at her hand, at the lifeblood she was offering so freely. Every instinct screamed at him to take it, to drain her, to sate the agonizing hunger. But through the red haze of his thirst, he saw her eyes. He saw the trust, the love. He was shaking, a fine tremor running through his entire body. This was the ultimate test. To conquer the monster not with suppression, but with a greater, stronger feeling. He closed his eyes, focusing on the warmth that had been growing in his chest, the feeling he now knew was love. He pushed the snarling thirst down, smothering it with the image of her smile, the memory of her laughter. Slowly, shakily, he rose from his throne and descended the dais. He took her offered hand, his cold fingers wrapping around hers. He lifted her palm to his lips, the scent of her blood nearly undoing him. But he did not drink. He did not bite. He simply pressed his lips to the wound, a gentle, reverent kiss. And as he did, he felt a jolt. A surge of power far greater than any magic he'd ever known. It was a dam breaking, a supernova igniting within him. The pain was the first thing. Searing, blinding agony, as 1,000 years of sensory deprivation ended in a single explosive instant. The gray void of his vision erupted into a kaleidoscope of overwhelming color. The velvet draperies were deep, painful crimson. The moonlight through the window was brilliant, sharp silver. The gold threads in her dress were like fire. Sound crashed over him, the echo of his own movement, the whisper of her breath, the frantic, deafening drumming of his own heart as it suddenly, violently, lurched back to life. A beat. Another. A rhythm. He could feel blood, his own blood, surging through his veins, hot and alive. He gasped, a true shuddering intake of air that filled his lungs with the scent of her, of dust, of old stone, of life. It was too much. The world was too loud, too bright, too full. And then came the emotions. A tsunami. 1,000 years of unfelt grief for his lost family crashed over him. The crushing guilt for every life he'd taken, every act of cold cruelty he'd committed, rose like bile in his throat. The profound, bottomless loneliness of his long existence washed through him, a cold so deep it was a fire. And then, cutting through it all, was the love. The overwhelming, terrifying, magnificent love he felt for the woman standing before him. It was a brilliant, white-hot sun at the center of his being, a force so powerful it eclipsed everything else. It was joy and terror and hope and gratitude, all mingled into one unbearable, beautiful feeling. Tears, hot and real, streamed down his face. He'd forgotten what they felt like. He fell to his knees, clutching her hand to his face, his body racked with sobs torn from the very depths of his newly awakened soul. He was broken. He was whole. He was a monster. He was a man. "Lyra," he choked out, her name a prayer on his lips. She knelt before him, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. Her touch was no longer searing shock, but gentle, grounding warmth. "Welcome back, Adrian," she whispered, her own eyes shimmering with tears. He had lost the wager. He'd lost his cold, unbreachable fortress of self. He'd lost the eternal gray peace of nothingness. And in its place, he'd gained everything. He looked up at her through the blur of his tears and saw not a witch, not a subject, but his salvation, his anchor, his love. His humanity had returned, a painful, glorious, all-consuming flood, and he was grateful, so profoundly grateful, to have lost. He was no longer a king on a throne of ice. He was a man on his knees, deeply and irrevocably in love. The days that followed were a storm of a different kind. The sensory onslaught didn't abate, it simply became the new, terrifying reality. Every scent was novel, every texture a discovery. His own heartbeat was a frantic, unfamiliar drum against his ribs, constant reminder of the fragile living engine that now powered him. Lyra didn't leave his side. She was his anchor in the raging sea of his restored senses. The thirst remained but transformed. It was no longer cold, mindless hunger, but manageable need, like mortal hunger. He drank still, but sparingly, spelled blood wines, animal sources. They were learning together. He kept his promise. Gold flowed from his vaults to fund her sanctuary. But his greatest contribution wasn't his wealth. It was himself. He began to walk his own halls in daylight, a painful, gradual process. His restoration had brought unexpected changes. The sun, while never comfortable, no longer meant instant death. His returned humanity created a buffer. He was neither fully vampire nor fully mortal, but something between. A twilight creature. He learned to eat again, each meal a revelation. An apple was a universe of sweetness and tartness. Water was clean, cool blessing. He learned to sleep, genuine exhaustion, terrifying surrender. But when sleep finally took him, it was profound peace. Quiet darkness that healed rather than imprisoned. He dreamed in color. He dreamed of a future with her. One evening, months later, he stood with Lyra on the highest balcony, watching the sunset. The sky was a blaze of orange and purple and pink, a breathtaking painting that still filled him with reverent awe. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her close, resting his chin on her shoulder. He could feel the steady beat of her heart against his chest, familiar, comforting rhythm. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly, gaze on the fading light. The power? The certainty? He considered the question. He thought of the cold, silent throne, the absolute control, the absence of pain and fear, the long, gray peace. "I miss the silence sometimes," he admitted honestly. "The world is a very loud place, but I wouldn't trade a single moment of this noise, this color, this feeling, for another 1,000 years of that peace." "That wasn't peace, Lyra. It was oblivion. You didn't just give me back my humanity. You gave me back my life." She turned in his arms, face illuminated by the last rays of sun. The love in her eyes was his constant miracle. "And you, Adrian," she said, hand resting over his heart, the heart that beat for her. "You gave me a reason to believe my magic was more than just words and wishes. You proved that nothing is ever truly lost." He smiled, genuine, warm expression that now came easily. He was no longer the cold king of a dead kingdom. He was a man, flawed and scarred, but alive and deeply loved. He had lost a foolish wager and, in doing so, had won the entire world. He leaned down and kissed her as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. Two souls bound together, a living testament to the fact that even after the longest, darkest night, the sun can always rise again. They say love can conquer anything, even death itself. Tonight we discovered the truth, that a frozen heart can indeed be thawed, but only by the rarest magic of all. Not spells or rituals or ancient power, but by the simple, terrifying choice to feel again, to be vulnerable, to love. King Adrian traded 1,000 years of cold certainty for a single moment of warm, messy, beautiful humanity. And in the end, he learned what we all must: that to truly live is not to avoid pain, but to embrace it. To let the fire in, even knowing it might burn. Because some things are worth the risk. Some things are worth losing everything for.
Love is one of them.